أبد والله يا زهراء ما ننسى حسينا، أبد والله يا زهراء ما ننسى حسينا. عشق كبار لأبو الأكبر، حياة وموت وياه.
البشر عدها العشق ويا الوقت تلقاه عادة، وانا حب الحسيني يختلف لنا عبادة. نشأ لحمي وكبر فهمي على حبه من الولادة. عبر اسمه على سمع وبدأت اتهجى اسمه حسين، وحاشا لا والله تشابه اسمه كله. اذكر امي قالت لي خدمتك هذه نعمة، حسين الخير كل الخير هني على اللي يخدمه. حمد لله الرزق جانا وعلى الفطرة خدمنا.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير. الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا، وهو العزيز الغفور. الذي خلق السبع سماوات طباقا ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت، فارجع البصر هل ترى من فطور. ثم ارجع البصر كرتين ينقلب إليك البصر خاسئا وهو حسير. ولقد زينا السماء الدنيا بمصابيح وجعلناها رجوما للشياطين وأعتدنا لهم عذاب السعير. وللذين كفروا بربهم عذاب جهنم وبئس المصير. إذا ألقوا فيها سمعوا لها شهيقا وهي تفور. تكاد تميز من الغيظ كلما ألقي فيها فوج سألهم خزنتها. سألهم خزنتها ألم يأتكم نذير قالوا بلى قد جاءنا نذير فكذبنا وقلنا ما نزل الله من شيء إن أنتم إلا في ضلال كبير وقالوا لو كنا نسمع أو نعقل ما كنا في أصحاب السعير صدق الله العلي العظيم.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير، والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله نور السماوات والأرض. صدق الله العلي العظيم. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman across the globe, wherever you may be, Salamun alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: why does evil exist? We've been discussing and we've been looking at the question and on the quest of meaning, that is the journey towards meaning in our life. And we've covered a substantial amount of ground on this journey. And understanding this journey, we have come to the realization that from the vantage point of a follower of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, that the quest for meaning, the root and the heart and the essence of it lies at the concept of Tawheed. That is, the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, that is the Holy Prophet, the Messenger himself, and the legacy of the 124,000 prophets and those that came before the Holy Prophet was on the basis and the foundation of monotheism, on the basis and the foundation of belief in one God and pointing towards that reality. And when we discuss this notion that the prophets and the imams do not focus on people following them for their own sake. Now, in this understanding of our worldview, of our narrative, we must first unravel, and we have been unraveling in the last few nights, this idea about where does our worldview come from in the first place. That is, it doesn't come in a vacuum. It doesn't come out of nowhere. There is a systematic way in which your worldview has been formed, whether you realize it or not. And many times this worldview has been formed and has been formed for generations before you even come into this world. That is, whether it was in the Middle East or North Africa or, for example, in Asia, in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, you will notice that the generations that were there before, who ended up in, for example, Europe and the United States, that movement towards a particular worldview had begun. Whether it was intentional or not or anything, it ended up being the reality and the norm. Now, discussing this, does this mean in any way that we are against modernism, that we are against progress, that we are against development? This question needs to be looked at more carefully. the wrong impression should not be given to the viewer with respect to the position of science and progress and technology. Therefore, in our discussion tonight, we want to look at and try to tackle some of the biggest questions that exist in the life of a young person or an elderly in this modern world. That is, regardless of your age, reconciling some of the biggest questions that emerge in your life can be one of the stepping stones towards mental clarity, towards clarity of the heart, and ultimately towards a God-centric and a God-conscious life. Because we mentioned in the previous nights, Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'inna al-qulub, that verily in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do the hearts find solace. But until there is not mental clarity, until there is not mental understanding and clarity of the heart, one will not have the right intent, the right thoughts, which give rise to the right ideas, which give rise to the right words, which give rise to the right actions, and ultimately the right character and the right destiny of life. The thoughts process, the principles of belief, all of those must foundationally be clear. So the first question that we'll look at in our analysis tonight is the worldview that has been cultivated in our modern world, whether it is Eastern or Western. What is that worldview of modernity and modernism, of progress in society, of evolution, of Darwinism, of scientism? All of these isms that exist, how do they relate to you and I as people who dwell in the modern world and live in the modern world? Within this, we'll discuss what is our position on modernism, progress, development, for example, scientism and the likes, and where do we fall in this spectrum? Because whether we realize it or not, we are engaging in these conversations, either consciously or subconsciously. This is impacting our way of life. The third level is looking at this very big and very fundamental question of our modern world about why evil exists. One of the questions that has led so many people to flee religion because of the fact that this question has not been resolved adequately to the satisfaction of the individuals who ask this question. Finally, what can we learn about from the parable of blind men? For example, what can we learn about the parable of the flat land and allow us to understand our worldview and understand the worldview of a God-centric world? And ultimately, what was that trait that the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam possessed, which they inspired their followers, their close commanders, their close comrades, their close companions to endeavor in, that was the opposite of skepticism? And how did we see that on the plains of Karbala on the 10th of Muharram? This is our schedule and our agenda for the brief moments that we have together. Wherever you may be across the globe, from the bottom of your heart, send a salawat on Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. The first element and the first question that we need to outline here is, are we against, for example, progress? Are we against modernity? Are we against development in society? Or are we against scientism? One thing that should be known as full disclosure for the audience is that by no means are we against modern science. Are we by no means against the development? I myself, as the one addressing you, have a background in engineering. I've been formally trained in the sciences and in the engineering, and I know that there is tremendous value, which I've been highlighting in the previous nights. That is, the modern development of modern technology, of modern engineering, of the new devices that we have, of the infrastructure that we have in buildings, of those things in the digital infrastructure sphere. There's no doubt about the benefits of it. And especially, and least of not which, is modern science in terms of the domain of medicine. There has been so much development in the last 100 years in the space of modern medicine, from solving the plagues and those things that are antibacterials, and all of these things which have led to millions and millions of lives being saved, or the antivirals, or all of these things that have curbed and improved the quality of life of so many people across the globe. One cannot deny this. At the same time, we must be very cautious. We must be very careful of trying to replace the progress, the benefit, and all of that which comes from science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We must be careful and cognizant of not using that to replace God. That's what the essence of the issue is. That is, that science, mathematics, engineering, technology have their space, have their place in our domain. And there's no denying this. And it is one should endeavor in this space. However, we should not think that this is a replacement for God. It's very important to understand what happened in the 19th century, that is the 1800s, and what happened in the 20th century of our world, that is the 1900s, and how that led to us having a particular worldview. In particular, if you read the pages of history, as Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, Amir al-Mu'mineen, encourages his son to, in the wasiyah that you will find of Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, "My son, I studied the pages of history, and it was as if I was walking amongst the ruins of the past civilization." I'm paraphrasing what is attributed to be the phrases and the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Of course, Amir al-Mu'mineen is much more eloquent, and the essence and depth of meaning is at a much higher level. But he's saying something, and he's pointing at a reality here. Does Amir al-Mu'mineen not know history? He has knowledge from a different realm, but he's giving some insight for you and I to perhaps reflect on. I endeavored and I studied the past civilizations, although my life was not as long as theirs. But I saw what brought them good and what brought them harm, what brought them progress and what brought them destruction, so to speak. I saw what was good for them and what benefited them and what harmed them. And in this, although I didn't live as long as many of them had lived, I was still able to benefit from the wisdom that they learned. If you remember a few nights ago, we mentioned this concept that in Islam, knowledge, wisdom is the lost property of a believer. You should obtain it from wherever. However, that knowledge, that wisdom should not conflict and should not contradict the teachings, the accurate traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, the authentic ones as explained to us by the scholars, and it should not contradict the Quran, again as explained to us by the Ahlul Bayt and the righteous scholars. If it does not contradict these, there is nothing wrong in adopting principles of wisdom and hikmah in our life. So Amir al-Mu'mineen says, learn from the pages of history. So what do the pages of history teach us? What do the pages of history show us? Three elements emerged in the 19th century and the 20th century. These were different concepts. These were different philosophies that were all had their own distinct concept. And they were, for example, the likes of evolution, the concept of Darwinism, the concept of progress in society. These three were distinct philosophies. However, they became emerged and entangled and intertwined into one philosophy that became the foundation of Western society, Western philosophical society. When I say Western philosophy, it should be noted, I should define the term. We are not talking about a particular country or a particular set of countries. And we are not talking about a geography either. You can very well have a country or a group or a nation or an individual who is following Western philosophy, although they may be living in Japan, they may be living in Indonesia, they may be living in Australia, which geographically may not be the West. Nonetheless, it has the philosophical underpinnings. We are not pointing to any countries in particular. We are talking about a worldview. Now, with respect to this concept of evolution, and this concept of progress and this concept of Darwinism. Darwinism came forward with this notion that people began to say survival of the fittest. And on top of that, progress was this idea intertwined with evolution. This idea that as society gets better, moves forward in terms of time, that is, from the 17th century to the 18th century to the 19th century to the 20th century, the concept and the idea was that the 20th century is better than the 19th century. And the 19th century is better than the 18th century. And the 18th century is better than the 17th century. And so on and so forth till the beginning of time. That is, as time progresses, things get better. And although this narrative sounds wonderful, there are problems with it. For example, what? The bloodshed that occurred in the 20th century, although there was so much benefit from the scientific aspect, so much benefit from the medical aspect, so much benefit from the engineering aspect, nonetheless, the bloodshed that World War I showed, the bloodshed that World War II showed, the bloodshed that, for example, the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the bloodshed, for example, in communist China and throughout the globe, this showed that although scientific progress is occurring, ethical principles still need to be outlined. Otherwise, how can you justify 30 million people being killed at one moment and then another 30 plus million being killed in another world war? That is, that human beings and humanity's compass of righteousness was not aligned. Otherwise, why would these types of vicious concepts emerge? On top of that, all of the major philosophical concepts of the 19th and 20th century, predominantly led by communism and capitalism, were based on this concept of material progress and material progress alone. That is, it did not have space for a concept or a worldview that was immaterial in nature. That is, how do you inject God, or how do you calculate God into the equation of the puzzle? Now, bringing all these concepts together and understanding where your worldview comes from, I will try to bring this to your attention in the form of a beautiful parable. This parable has its roots in the Indian philosophy, and it was used by Hindu philosophers, Buddhist philosophers, and also Sufi mystics, and those in the dominion of all of these different spaces. A wide variety of different people and different spaces and different tribes and people have used this. You benefit from, in using this, the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt in terms of lost property of a believer is wisdom, that is. And therefore, understand the principle of what is being stated here so that you may understand what is our relationship with our modern world. We're told there's a moment in time in history where there were some blind men who saw a creature before them. When these blind men saw a creature before them, they began to be perplexed and intrigued by this creature. They did not know, or this thing before them, which they assumed. So there were these individuals who, according to the tale and the fable, there were 6 of them. And they begin to take a step forward towards this thing that is before them. To them, it is just a thing. They don't know. Because, of course, they are blind. One man steps forward and he begins to feel the object in front of him. When he begins to feel the object in front of him, at that point in time, he begins to put his hands and he begins to feel the surface. And he says, the wideness of this, the firmness of this, it is very clear that what is here is a wall. The other man steps forward, a few steps away, and he begins to feel, and he begins to feel, and he begins to feel. Of course, he doesn't have the benefit of his eyesight. They're all blind in this town of the blind. And he begins to feel and feel and feel. And then he's moving his hand along this object. When he's moving the hand along the object, it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower, and ends up at a tip, at a point. And when he touches this, he pricks his finger. At that point in time, he says, whoa, this, what I have before me, is most definitely a spear. This is the second man. A few steps next to this very man, the next blind man steps forward and he begins to put his hand on this object and he begins to feel the object and he begins to try to understand the reality that is before him. Again, not having the benefit of eyesight, he must understand the reality before him based on the feeling, the sensation of the hands and the feeling. He begins to say, what is this? This is something that is different, that I have not experienced. And he begins to notice the movement of it. He says, is this something that is as new to me? Something that he begins to see movements. He says, whoa, this is a snake that is before me. This is a snake that is here, most certainly. The first man says a wall. The second man says a spear. This other man begins to say that this is a snake. A few steps away, another man. The fourth man steps forward and he begins to feel the object in front of him. And he begins to feel the thinness of it. And he begins to feel the width of it. And he begins to feel the flapping nature of this object. And he says, most certainly this is a fan. The classical fan, the old fan, the hand fan that you would find in the East. He says, this is most certainly a fan. I'm absolutely certain about it. A few steps away, not too far, there was a man who began to feel the object again, and he began to say, this is wide and stable, and he begins to see that this is something, and he begins to feel this object, and he says, this is most certainly the trunk of a tree. This is a tree that we have before us. And then finally, one man steps not too far away, a few steps away. He begins to feel and he begins to see the object in front of him with his hands. And he begins to feel something thin, flexible, bendable, but at the same time, not like the one who said it was a snake, something else. He says, I know for certain what this is. I know for certain that this before us is absolutely a rope. How could it be that these men, 6 different men, 6 different understandings? One man is saying that this is a wall in front of us. One man is saying that this is a spear. The other is saying this is a snake. The other is saying this is a fan. The other is saying this is a tree. And one more is saying that this is a rope. We're told a man passes by the town who is able to see. A man who is able to see passes by the city of the blind, or the town of the blind. And he begins to say, "Well, man, what's the dilemma? What's the problem? Why this argument that is ensuing amongst you? What's going on?" They said that we are trying to reconcile what is in front of us. What is this? Is this a wall? Is this a snake? Is this a spear? Is this a fan? Is this a tree? Is it a rope? What is it? And the man begins to smile and look towards the object. He says, "I can see why you're saying what you're saying." He said, "What did the first man say?" He says, "This is most certainly a wall." He said, "Where did you feel this object?" He said, "I felt it here." He said, "Very well." The second man, "What did you feel? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you believe this to be?" He says, "This is most certainly a spear. Especially as I got to the pointed end and I pricked my finger, I could tell that this was most certainly something that is more sharp and something that we must be careful of." Very well. He says, the man who can see says, "I can see how you got that." The third man, he says, "What did you see? What did you feel? What did you see with your hands, so to speak?" He says, "This is most certainly a snake. No doubt in my mind about it." He said, "Very well, I can see how you got to that conclusion." He goes to the next man, "What did you conclude?" He said, "This is a fan. There's no doubt in my mind about it." The next man says, "What did you see? What did you conclude?" He says, this is a tree. I can tell by the trunk." He says, "Very well." And the final man, "What did you conclude?" He says, "This is a rope." All of the men, he tells them, "I can see how you came to this conclusion. But, O men, allow me to tell you before I continue on my journey that this is neither a wall, and neither is this a spear, and neither is this a snake, and neither is this a fan, and neither is this a tree, and neither is this a rope." They said, "Then what is it?" He said, "Gentlemen, what you have before you is an elephant." They were shocked and mesmerized. An elephant. They had not seen this before. He says at that point in time that an elephant, yes, the side which you called a wall, that was the side of the elephant. And what you called the spear, that was the tusk of the elephant. And what you called the snake was the trunk of the elephant. And what you called the fan was actually the ear of the elephant. And what you called the tree trunk or the tree itself was actually the foot of the elephant. One of the 4 feet. And what was that rope that you thought was a rope was actually the tail. So, gentlemen, you did not consider perhaps merging your views in order to see the entire comprehensive picture through at least your hands. They became shocked. Well, how are we supposed to know that? How are we supposed to understand that? How are we supposed to know that? How is this understandable? How is this fair? How is this rational? How is this reasonable? The man who could see, he began to smile as he walked off into the distance and began to leave the town in the city of the blind. He said, "It could have been worse." The men asked, "How could it have been worse?" He said, "Your elephant could have been on the run. It could have been moving." This idea or this concept of the parable of the blind men and the elephant allows us to understand our worldview and many of the questions that lie in our world and how we look to analyze it. When we come to the issue of modernity, when we come to the issue of progress, when we come to the issue of development, when we come to the issue of evolution, Darwinism, or scientism for that matter, and scientism must be defined appropriately, all of these aspects are like the individual, the blind man who is looking at one aspect of the aspects of the elephant. One person is looking at the side of the elephant. One is looking at the feet of the elephant. One is looking at the tail of the elephant. One is looking at the tusk. One is looking at the trunk. One is looking at the ear. All of them in their own domain are right. In their own domain are correct. In their own space are correct. Yet, if you begin to say that the tusk of the elephant or the trunk of the elephant is the entire elephant, you will not have understood the whole concept. Therefore, in its domain of expertise, there is no doubt that medicine has tremendous benefits and has helped save so many lives in our modern world. But to say that medicine replaces God, we must be very cautious. We must be very, very, very careful about our narrative and our viewpoint. Many people on this planet, although they proclaim, not my words, the words of experts who have dedicated their life to religion and religion studies across the globe, argue that many people on this planet who say and proclaim that they believe in God with their tongue and with their mouth, they in fact believe in scientism. This is true in the East and the West and throughout the globe. That the first primary element of our world is that scientism is the end-all be-all belief system of our world. Everything is secondary to that. Do I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives, for example, cure? That doesn't mean that I don't take modern medicine. That doesn't mean that I neglect the sciences. Not at all. We take the medicine and we are instructed to do so. We're supposed to follow the guidelines of science. Again, I repeat, I come from a scientific background myself. I am not here to try to cast doubt on science. What I'm asking here, and I'm asking you to reflect on, is science the entire elephant, or is science one dimension of the reality that is what we call the elephant? Understanding this concept can help you understand our world better. I now come to this issue or this concept of our worldview relating to the question of evil in society. This question of why does evil exist in a society is one of the main questions that has led to people leaving the religion that is God-centric, whether that be the Abrahamic faiths or other faiths. They leave because they cannot answer this question to their satisfaction. That is, how can a God who knows all, who is all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful, who is omnipotent, who is omnipresent, who has all of this omnipotent, how can a God like this allow evil to exist in our world? How do you answer this? One very interesting observation that comes in this question is what some philosophers and some experts in religious study have said. This dynamic of people leaving religion because of the issue of evil is a purely Western philosophical problem. Why? If you go to a place that is based on Eastern philosophy, for example, or Islamic philosophy for that matter, you will not find, especially going back 50 years or 100 years, you would not find somebody who goes and is a baker in a city such as, for example, Pakistan, or a city in Lebanon, for example, if someone is a believer in God and God-centric in either of those countries, or a country such as Egypt, wherever it may be, a person who is feeding numerous people in their family, they would not go home and say that my life is difficult, therefore God does not exist. This phenomenon emerged in the last 50 to 100 years. And it was purely a Western phenomenon. Why? Because from the Eastern perspective, not only Islam, by the way, in the perspective of, for example, even Hinduism or Shintoism, but in also Islam, this concept of the worldview is different and does not allow and does not lead for a person to leave faith and leave religion, because evil, as it is defined in the mind of the Western philosophical mind, is defined, or I should rather say the progressive mind, the economic mind of the modern world, the mind of scientism, progress and development. All of these catch-all terms, which sound great on the surface and have many benefits, but again, are only like one dimension of the elephant in the analogy that we gave. All of those elements have taken place and superseded and have become known as what is Western philosophy. I digress. It's a very long discussion. We don't have time to discuss that element, but understand and just reflect and do tafakkur and tadabbur on where your worldview is coming from. This question of evil, it doesn't exist in Islamic societies, or even it did not exist in the past in Islamic societies or Hindu societies or Shinto societies. Why? Because the philosophy went like this, that this world, this universe of ours is a creation of God. It is not God. It is a creation of God. It is not God. That is, that I am sitting on this chair, I am sitting on it. This chair is not me. For example, and let's say I made the chair. If I made the chair, that chair is a creation of mine. Number one. Number two, creation implies separation. That is, when I create something, by definition, that creation of mine, for example, this chair, if I created it, that creation is not me. You see, therefore, creation implies separation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Almighty, created this world, created this universe. By virtue of creation, this world, this universe is not God, it's a creation. And the third level is that God is all perfection. Creation implies separation at the fourth level. Separation from the perfection, which is God, implies that our world, whatever it is, it will be less than perfect. Therefore, what you and I call evil is actually the separation from the perfection that is God, that manifests itself on the human plane as what we call evil. This would be analogous to seeing one aspect, the tail of the elephant, without seeing the entire elephant. We call it evil. There's an interesting book that I advise all of our audience to read, our viewers to read. It's called Flatland. It's an older book, but it's timeless. And the idea is, imagine yourself living in a two-dimensional world. A two-dimensional world, a world where it is flat, the XY plane only. We live, of course, in a three-dimensional world. A world that not only has length and width, but it also has depth, for example, or volume, length, mass. These dimensions, that's all three dimensions. But imagine living in a two-dimensional world. Imagine living in the world of the screen of your television, for example, in that screen in and of itself, in the XY plane alone, a two-dimensional world. Imagine this is the plane before you. Now I insert my finger, my three-dimensional finger, into this two-dimensional world. What would the person in the two-dimensional world see? Imagine you're playing a video game, one of the old video games, Tetris, for example, the two-dimensional ones, decades ago. And in that world, someone puts their three-dimensional figure. Remember, there's only two dimensions in this world. You put a three-dimensional figure, what do you see? What does Super Mario or whatever character see in that world? When they're looking from that vantage point, they will see a flesh-colored line in their two-dimensional world. A three-dimensional object put into a two-dimensional world will become a two-dimensional line. And the color of that line will be the color of the skin of the finger. So when that person who is in that world, the two-dimensional world, asks the question, what am I looking at? The answer will be that you are looking at a line. But is that really what is there? Much like the example of the elephants and the blind men. What you are seeing is what you are able to perceive. It's not necessarily reality. Therefore, what you and I call evil is our lack of understanding of the divine wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where we are seeing just the two-dimensional flesh-colored line and calling that evil. Yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees and creates the comprehensive picture. I give you the example, I was listening to NPR in the United States, National Public Radio, and on that there was a very striking interview of two philanthropists, a husband and wife in the United States in the Northeast Bloc, who had a child who was born with Down syndrome. Now, this is a trial, a test, a difficult thing for anyone to have to endure. And at that point in time, we're told that the interviewer asked these individuals who are philanthropists and had developed and created schools in the United States for families who have Down syndrome children to be able to benefit and educate themselves and their loved ones there. And they asked the question, the journalists gathered the strength and asked the question, this child of yours, this child, if you could go back in time, now it's been 18, 20 years, if you could go back in time, would you want this child to be born the same way that this child has been born 20 years ago? Or would you want them to be, quote unquote, different? Normal, as someone would call it, quote unquote. The answer was striking from the parents. The parents said, if it was up to us, we would want for our child to not have to go through this for his sake. But if it were up to us, we would want this child to be born the exact same way. The journalist said, why? How? What's going on? Explain that to me. For the child, you would never want it to happen. For you, you would want it to happen again. Why? The same way. He said, for the child, it's a very big test. It's a very big test for our child. We don't want him to suffer. We're parents, after all. But for us, we believe that there's a wisdom in this, that we became softer hearted. We became more loving. We became more affectionate by means of our child and this Down syndrome that our child had. That we would have spent our money that we have been given, that we have gained, we would have spent it on other things. Maybe boats and cars and houses and yachts and the likes. We would not have considered spending it on these institutions that we've established for other families that have Down syndrome children. You see, sometimes we think we know better than God. We think that we know the mind of God. Understand the principles of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Understand how the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam operated. And then you will understand the concept of Tawheed and living a God-centric life. We will continue in our next conversation on the manhaj and the viewpoint of the Ahlul Bayt and their view on God and these big questions of existence and how they saw and how they rationally proved the existence of God so that our foundation of belief is true. The Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, they did not delve in skepticism. They did not delve in doubt. Rather, they delved in yaqeen, in certainty. And you saw certainty manifest itself in the personality of Amir al-Mu'mineen, in the personality of Imam Hassan, in the personality of Imam al-Hussein. And you indeed saw certainty develop and manifest itself in the personality of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas is not an ordinary individual. Al-Abbas is Abdul Salih al-Muti'u lillahi wa li rasulih, as we say in the ziyarah. That he is someone who is of an extraordinary caliber, not only from his perspective of his courage and his valor, but from his obedience to the Imam and his taqwa and his God consciousness and his wara and all of these dimensions. Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, we are told, on the 10th of Muharram, on the day of Ashura, he comes to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. He says, Sayyidi wa Mawlai, allow me the permission, grant me the permission to go towards the battlefield. Allow me to go and defend you. Allow me to go and protect you. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is not giving him the permission to go. One after the other, Abbas asks for permission. We are told that finally, after much insistence, and when the voices were heard from the children, Al-Atash, Al-Atash, the thirst, Abbas, so as to say, said, I cannot take it anymore. My master, allow me to go. We are told Imam gives Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas the permission to go, but he does not give him the permission to fight. Abbas gets on his horse and he proceeds towards the battlefield. When he proceeds towards the battlefield, we are told that the enemy on the other side, they became perplexed. It was as if the haiba of Abu Fadl al-Abbas, he made way and he made way and he went straight towards the bank of the river stream. When he got there, he descended down from his horse and he looked towards the water. When he looked towards the water, we are told that he filled the water skin and he lifts the water into his hands and he looks into the water that's in his hands, and it is as if he is speaking to his soul, to his nafs, as if he is saying, will you drink water while your master is thirsty? He throws the water back. He does not drink. He gets back onto this horse. Abbas begins to proceed towards the tents. Back. When he begins to proceed back towards the tents, we are told that the enemy, they begin to try to ambush and attack Abu Fadl al-Abbas. Someone strikes the hand of Abu Fadl al-Abbas. The right hand of Abu Fadl is severed. It is cut. He moves the water skin to the other side, the flag to the other side. But a moment later, someone else strikes the left hand of Abu Fadl. His other hand is severed. He takes the water skin in his mouth. He is swaying on top of the horse. It is as if he is saying, "Oh horse, just get me to that tent. Just get me to the tent where Sukaina is, where Ruqayya is, where the family of Sayyid Shabbir is. Let them get this water." But the enemies did not stop. They took aim for the face of Qamar Bani Hashim, Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, the moon of Banu Hashim. They struck him in his eye. When they struck him in his eye, he began to sway more and more on the horse, and he began to fall. He called out, "Ya akhi, ya Hussein, adrikni." My brother, Imam al-Hussein, come to my assistance. He had not called him that before, but there was this moment was different for Abu Fadl. They say Imam al-Hussein raced to Abu Fadl. When he got there, how did he see his brother Qamar Bani Hashim? He fought off the enemy. He cleared the way. He saw Abbas. But what state? Because Abbas was very tall only a few moments ago. Now his hands had been cut. There was an arrow in his eye. Imam al-Hussein took Abbas's head and put it in his lap. And then he noticed what? He noticed that Abbas moved his head. And then Imam al-Hussein put it again. And then he removed it again. And then Imam al-Hussein did it a third time. He said, "Abbas, why do you move your head from my lap?" He says, "Sayyidi wa Mawlai, I'm thinking about that moment." "Ya Abbas, which moment?" He says, "That moment which will only be a few moments from now, when you will fall from your horse. Who will there be for you that you would put your head in their lap? How can I have this honor when you have no one for yourself?" At that moment, Imam al-Hussein wanted to take the body back towards the tents. He says, "My master, do not take me back to the tents." "Why, Abbas?" "Because I promised Sakina, I promised Suqayyana, I promised Ruqayya, I promised the children, the daughters of you, my Imam, that I would bring water. I was not able to bring water." They say that Abbas made a request to Sayyid Shuhada. What was the request? The poets have written this in their eulogies. The heart laments when you hear about Abbas. Why? That he had a wish. What was the wish? That when he came into this world, the first person he saw, and the last person that he sees when he leaves this world, is Imam al-Hussein. Abbas, look at your master, look at Hussein. Why don't you look at him? My master, my Mawla. There is blood in my eyes, I cannot see, and I would wipe it away myself, but I have no hands to remove the blood. If you could give me one final moment where I can see you, I would not trouble you once again. Ajrukum ala Allah. It is the night of Abbas. Do not hold back your tears. One final narration and I conclude. We are told that there was a moment when the scholars, one of the Sayyids, the Marja' of the time, he had taken the Shia and they had gone for the ziyarah of Abu Fadil. When they had gone for the ziyarah of Abu Fadil, we are told that the believers, some of them had seen the grave for the first time of Abu Fadil. When they saw the grave of Abu Fadil for the first time, they said, Sayyid, we have a question. Well, how can we ask it to you? He says, what's the question? He said, we heard that Abu Fadil was very tall. We heard that he was a very strong man, a very tall man, that he was Qamaru Bani Hashim, the moon of Banu Hashim, in which every one of them was a moon. This was Abbas. He said, yes, it's true. There's no doubt. There's no denying. They said, the question is, then how is it that his grave is so small and he was so big? He began to cry. The Sayyid began to lament. He said, Abbas was very tall, but they cut him into so many pieces. This is all that remains of Abu Fadil. This is all that remains of the son of Ummul Baneen. Ummul Baneen. Do not complain about Abbas. He was loyal and faithful to Imam al-Hussein till the final moments. There was an arrow in his eye. There is no one to blame him. We are told there was a reciter who was reciting the majlis of Abu Fadil. When he was reciting the majlis of Abu Fadil, we are told that night after reciting the musibah, he saw in a dream Abu Fadil came and said that, oh reciter, why don't you recite my musibah? Why do you not recite my calamity? He said, I recite your calamity. I tell them that you fought valiantly. I tell them that you sacrificed everything for Sayyid al-Shuhada. This reciter says, you don't he heard from Abu Fadil in the dream. You don't tell them how I fell from the horse. He says, whenever someone falls from a horse, they have their hands to support them. Oh reciter, I had no hands. I had an arrow in my eye. When I fell towards the ground, there was nothing except my face and the arrow.
Ajarakum Allah on the eve of Ashura. Imam al-Hussein would gather his companions. He would withdraw his allegiance from them. He would say to them, take the darkness of this night and go out. You don't have to stay by me, Ajarakum Allah. His companions would tell him, no, Abu Abdullah, we will stay with you until we are martyred. Some of his companions would say to him, oh Abu Abdullah, if we were to be killed and cut into pieces and then being burnt, and for that to happen 1,000 times, we will never leave you, O Abu Abdullah. And that is what truly happened. And Abu Abdullah al-Hussein would say to his sister Zainab, oh Zainab, know that I have never seen or never known of companions like my companions, and no family like those of the members of my family. And that was so true on the day of Ashura, when you see the companions and how thirsty they were, not necessarily just for martyrdom, but for aiding Abu Abdullah al-Hussein and being martyred through this way. Ajarakumullah. When the day of Ashura came, Imam al-Hussein would put Habib ibn Mudahir as the commander of the right wing of the army. He would bring Zuhair as the commander of the left wing of the army, and he would give the flag to Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. Ajarakumullah. Ajarakumullah, they would go into the battlefield fighting. Habib would go and he would fight and he would kill many of their men, shouting, I am this old man and I will kill you. Then he would come back as to rest for a little bit. He would come back and he would face Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. This scene is very painful to remember. He would come, he would face Abu Abdullah al-Hussein as he's walking towards the tents. Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, his back is towards the tents. As Habib is approaching Imam al-Hussein, his tears start to flow down his cheeks. He would start to cry. Imam al-Hussein looks at him. He says to him, Oh Habib, did you remember your family? Did you remember the status that you had? Oh Habib, you can leave right now. You don't have to stay. He said to him, No, oh Abu Abdullah. He said, What is making you cry then? He said to him, Oh Abu Abdullah, that woman standing by that tent is the one making me cry. Imam al-Hussein would turn around, he would see Sayyidah Zainab. What is she shouting? Is there no one to aid and support us? This was what was making Habib cry. Then he would look at Imam al-Hussein, he would say to him, Oh Abu Abdullah, can I say 2 words to Sayyidah Zainab? Imam al-Hussein would give him permission. He would talk to Sayyidah Zainab. Habib was one of the closest companions of Imam Ali alayhi salam. He had some knowledge of the balaya, of the misfortunes that are to happen. He had some knowledge of the ways death will happen. He would turn around to Sayyidah Zainab. This is the knowledge that Amir al-Mu'mineen would give him. He turns around to Sayyidah Zainab. He says to her, Oh Sayyidah Zainab, yes, you will see us martyred. Yes, you will see that Imam al-Hussein has no aid and no support. But oh Sayyidah Zainab, prepare yourself for the time that you will walk in the city of Sham. Ajarakumullah, Habib ibn Mudahir would go back into the battlefield until he was martyred. And likewise with all the other companions, including Hur, he would turn around to Abu Abdullah. He says to him, Oh Abu Abdullah, I am the one that didn't allow you to return. Allow me to be of the first to enter the battlefield. He would go into the battlefield fighting like a brave warrior until one of the enemies would hit the horse's legs. The horse would fall on the floor. Hur would then stand on his feet and he would shout, I am Hur, the son of Hur. Zuhair ibn al-Qayn would then start to fight with al-Hur. They would fight back to back. Every time someone attacks Hur, Zuhair would defend him. Every time someone would hit Zuhair, al-Hur would defend him. That is until al-Hur would then fall martyred on the floor. He would call out to Abu Abdullah. Imam al-Hussein would come to al-Hur. He would sit beside him. He would say to him, You are Hur, you are free, just like your mother named you. In this world and in the hereafter, Zuhair ibn al-Qayn would carry on fighting for Imam al-Hussein, and that is until Dhuhr Salah would come. They would pray Salat al-Dhuhr, Salat al-Khawf, half of the army in front of Imam al-Hussein, the other half behind him. Zuhair ibn al-Qayn being the one who is leading the front half. Ajarakumullah, they start shooting them with arrows and spears. Some of the companions of Abu Abdullah would fall like that. One of the companions would turn around to Abu Abdullah. He would say to him, Oh Abu Abdullah, I did not fight and I am about to die. Have I done enough? He said to him, Yes, and you have attained martyrdom and you will be entering heaven before me. Ajarakumullah, after the salah was done, Zuhair would go back into the battlefield fighting them, shouting, I am Zuhair, I am Zuhair. Zuhair was one of those who were against the Shia. Someone turns around to him, he says to him, I never knew that you were of the Shia. You were always against them. He said to them, Does this not stand show you who I am with now? And he would fight them, Ajarakumullah, until look at the companions and look at their thirst for martyrdom. Yes, until he knew that it was close to him, until he knew that he had not much left in him. He would come back to Imam al-Hussein. He would look at Imam al-Hussein. He would say to him, فدتك فدتك نفسي هاديا مهديا، اليوم ألقى جدك النبيا، والحسن والمرتضى عليا، والشهيد ذو الجناحين الحيا. Oh, Aba Abdullah, I would give my soul towards you. Today I will be meeting your grandfather, I will be meeting Amir al-Mu'mineen, I will be meeting Imam al-Hassan as well as Ja'far al-Tayyar. He would go into the battlefield fighting them until the enemies would circle him. They start shooting him with arrows, they hit him with spears, then they cut him into pieces. Aywa Husayna. And likewise with all of the companions, Ajarakumullah, they would fall one after the other until Aba Abdullah al-Hussein would be in a state where no companions are around him anymore. He would start shouting out, Habib, Zuhair, Burair, Nafi. He would call out his companions one after the other. Then he would say to them, Mali ad'ukum fala tujibun, am hala baynakum wa bayna sayyidikum al-manhun. Why is it that I call you and you do not answer? Or is it that death has parted between you and your master? هذا الرمح بفادة ثنى، وهذا به لأن الشاب رنى، وهذا الخيل صدر رضرضن، وهذا وذاك بالهنديم والذار. إنا لله.
صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، صلى الله عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، صلى الله عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين، خصوصا سيدي ومولاي أبا الفضل العباس ابن أمير المؤمنين.